Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Roger Hallam, one of the world's top climate campaigners, famous for being a founder of Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and Just Stop Oil, the most prominent social movements of recent years in the United Kingdom. He has worked as an advisor around the Western world, facilitating the creation of significant climate campaigns in Italy, Germany, and Sweden. Roger has been committed to social justice for decades, dropping out of LSE in his 20s to join the peace movement. Afterwards, he worked as an organic farmer in Wales for 30 years before unprecedented rains destroyed £100,000 worth of his crops. Having experienced climate breakdown firsthand, Roger recognized the need for societal change and became a researcher at King's College London. There, he produced award-winning research on the psychology of mobilisation and the design of civil disobedience. In 2018, he wrote the Tate Modern Book of the Month, Common Sense for the 21st Century, an introduction manual to Extinction Rebellion. In 2023, The New Statesman rated him as the 34th most influential progressive person in the United Kingdom, the highest position of any environmentalist apart from David Attenborough. In 2024, he wrote the introduction to A Green Day, Embracing Climate Action. I welcome Roger Hallam to Savage Minds. You have often described climate change as the battering ram for broader systemic change. How would you distinguish between achieving climate goals and achieving a total overhaul of the current political order?
Corporate capitalism has got to an obvious position where it's going to destroy itself and destroy the world. And that's not particularly an ideological proposition in so much as we're dealing with physics, and if we head towards 2 degrees centigrade, which we are doing, then we'll have triggered the major feedback mechanisms in the Earth system, and the main scenario is we'll move towards a runaway climate collapse. So I think what that means is that there's a limited amount of time to save the human race, as you might say. And in order to do that, then there has to be a systemic change or a revolutionary period whereby capitalism is constrained and transformed. And of course, there's plenty of debate about how to do that and, what comes afterwards and such like, which we can talk about. But I suppose the initial proposition is that we're not going to sort out the climate, as the liberal space calls it, without a systemic change in how we organise the economy and society.
In reading your introduction, I was very surprised to learn that you had spent so many years farming in Wales. I did a lot of work in the UK, especially in England and Cornwall, Devon area, where I learned a lot about what happened within Wales specifically regarding TAN 6. And I found this very hopeful, although such initiatives are not universal throughout the United Kingdom. Could you talk a bit about the advantages of what, let's say, TAN 6 would offer, even today in this very desperate economic climate where people in their 20s, 30s, I would even say older, because when I was living in central London, on the narrow boats, I just found day after day people moving on, just like me and my children, who were professionals unable to afford anything in London. So we're looking at where TAN 6 proposed and allowed for people to do work on the land, including certain kinds of autochthonous building of older types of architecture and compacted earth houses that would not otherwise have been allowed. Could you talk about this in terms of the kind of praxis that people are not aware of, I think, even within England?
Well, yeah, I was an organic farmer for 20 years and I used to grow vegetables and supply several thousand people with organic boxes of veg, if you know how that works. The main reason I stopped was because there was a year when it rained every day for 7 weeks, and I lost several £100,000 because it started on the 2nd of June and carried on every day for 7 weeks. By week 4, everything had rotted in the fields and I couldn't get the tractors on the fields. And then I think 2 years later, it was something like -15 for 2 weeks and I lost all my winter crops. And also we've been subject to more storms. So if I have a number of polytunnels and if the wind is around 18 miles an hour, maybe I might lose 1 tunnel out of 6. But if the wind goes over 100 miles an hour, say 100 miles an hour to 120 miles an hour, then I'll lose the covers of all the polytunnels. So one of the reasons I stopped was because as a medium-sized sort of farmer, it wasn't worth the risk of carrying on, which is a phenomenon that's, about to become a massive reason for social collapse, is because farmers will steadily not be able to take the risk of growing because of the regular extremities of temperature. So I think it's a little bit academic, really, whether people are doing growing or not. I think the issue at this stage, obviously 20, 30 years ago, it would be good to look at a number of, low impact ways of growing and all the rest of it. And obviously that's part of the equation, but there is a sort of tortuous balance between, adapting to what's coming and engaging in revolutionary activity to overcome the actual causal entity that's creating this, which is obviously the economic system and the various sort of cultures that sustain that.
In a way, what you've just described would be otherwise called a monsoon of sorts if it were not in the UK. And the kind of climate change that people on the right complain about, they think that activists like you, or even myself, are hyperbolic and that we're Debbie Downers. And it's not climate change. Since Noah and Jesus, the earth has always changed, might be one response. But this is something quite different. And could you talk about this kind of period that we're in? Because you have argued that we're in a pre-revolutionary period. And again, to echo my first question to you, that there are parallels between the kind of work that is being done on the climate front and the work being done on the political front. For many examples one could offer, your being jailed for activism is right up there with what our friends and colleagues at Palestine Action are facing. So now if you protest climate change, you're a criminal. If you protest genocide, you're a criminal. If you go to lunch with the current president of Syria, who was known as one of the greatest head choppers out there, that's okay, right? As 2 British MPs had dinner with him 18 months ago, before he was on the white list. Just a few weeks later, suddenly he disappeared from the most wanted list to new name, new beard, suit and tie. So if you could talk a bit about this kind of pre-revolutionary period we are in.
Yeah, well, obviously, like for the last 40 years, we've been subject to neoliberal sort of propaganda that we're at the end of history. And although people generally say they don't believe in the end of history, I think that ideology is so saturated into our culture and also in left culture that people find it very difficult to understand that revolutions will happen in the future in the same way as they've happened in the past, because fundamentally, that's what history is a series of revolutions or major ruptures through, ecological or social collapse. So all these things get mixed up together, of course. So there is a fairly sort of neutral discipline of looking at the sociology of revolutions. And the main sort of school in that area is a sort of structuralist school, which will say something along the lines of a society inevitably is heading towards a revolution at a certain stage where the fundamental structural elements of it are going to collapse, and they can be predicted because because there's a certain mathematics or physics to it. So, the classic example, I suppose, is when a civilization destroys its own ecological sustainability. But in more recent, last 200 or 300 years, two classic examples are the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. So as people may know, the French Revolution became effectively inevitable once the French state got into such a level of debt and the ruling classes of France refused to fund the state, that it got to the point where it was going to collapse within 6 weeks, I think it was. And that was the point at which an assembly was called, which hadn't been called for 150 years, I think. And that assembly created a cascade of mobilizations, which are called the French Revolution. The point being here is that states do collapse, and the major reason states collapse is because the ruling class or the elites refuse to become so powerful that they no longer feel any compulsion to pay their taxes. And this is the major dynamic, I suppose. And there's a similar example in a certain way with the Russian Revolution, that after February 1917, when the liberals took over the Russian state, there was this inevitability that the regime would collapse because the German army was so powerful that they were in a position to take over most of Russia. But because of the ideology of the Russian elites, including the left elites, they had the bright idea that they could still overcome the Germans, and they pushed ahead with an offensive in July 1917, which obviously got nowhere because of the maths of the situation, as it were. And the Germans advanced several hundred miles, and the only left space, or the most significant left space, that was opposed to that strategy was the Bolsheviks. And so the Bolsheviks became the most popular left space, and that was a primary reason why they became the new regime in October. So I think the point here is that elites, because of their excessive power, become hubristic, and they don't realize they're going to collapse even though they are. And at the moment, there's perfectly over-reporting, you might say, on why Western capitalism is going to collapse, probably in about 10 to 15 years from now, in the same way that people worked out that the mortgage system would collapse in, third quarter of 2007, right? Because it's a matter of mathematics at the end of the day. If people want to quickly go through the maths, we're at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're going up 0.4 per decade, so we're going to hit effectively 2 by 2035, and that will most likely lead to multiple days of 40, 45 degrees centigrade, which will destroy significant amounts of Western infrastructure and reduce agricultural levels by 25 to 50%. And you don't need to be a genius to work out that will lead to regime change. So that's, obviously there's a bit of variability. It could be a lot sooner than that if the insurance markets collapse, which they may well do. And there's nothing radical about this analysis, right? I mean, I was listening to the chief energy advisor to the Democratic Party about 10 years ago, who predicted that the insurance markets would collapse around 2027, and we're going to be at 1.7 next year because of the El Nino. So for anyone that wants an objective analysis, they know we're in a pre-revolutionary period. And having said that, like, a pre-revolutionary period obviously covers a multitude of sins. It's no guarantee that a pro-social collectivist left force will become hegemonic through that process. It's very likely that there will be various fascistic outcomes, whether left fascism or right-wing fascism. And that's obviously where the agency comes in. But there isn't agency in whether there's going to be revolutions or not. That's like set in stone now. because we're dealing with physics.
In 2022, there was, of course, the infamous M25 blockade. Some people have criticized you for your tactics. I have no idea why, because these are pacifist tactics. But I would like to know that your tactics are clearly intentionally disruptive. Some people have made the argument that this affects the economy, if it affects people getting to work. Well, that's the point of it, I presume, just like strikes. The point of strikes is to interrupt also, so that the message will make people beyond the heads of companies think about the rights of workers. But at what point does disruption become counterproductive to building the broad public consensus needed for public policy understanding and then, of course, policy change?
Yeah, well, I've spent most of my life looking at the effectiveness, the different forms of protest, as you call it. And my conclusion is that the main reason groups are unsuccessful is because they're trying to be successful. The sort of paradoxical sort of construction. But in most revolutions, they're initiated by people who are motivated broadly by virtue logics rather than instrumentalist logics. And at the present time, our culture is saturated in instrumentalist logics, both on the left and the right. And the problem with that is it always leads to a short-termism. And short-termism, by definition, is not smart because, reality is long-term. So it's important to understand that the strategies have come out, first of all, of the question, how are we to live our lives at a time of mass death, rather than how do we succeed? If we try and work out how we succeed, then in a pre-revolutionary period, the short-termist logics of the left will inevitably move towards reformist sort of outcomes, i.e., you're going to put off the public, so you should go through the system and such like. But all revolutionary movements obviously don't buy that logic, not because it's not logical, but because it's not virtuous. Obviously, different cultures use different words than virtue, but broadly speaking, what it means is you do something as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end. And the sort of disaster of Western and sort of global capitalistic and left culture, because both of them have the same orientation, is this constant focus on analysis rather than prophecy. And I mean prophecy in an anthropological sense of making the world as you wish to see it, according to various cultural traditions. And the reason why we've been so effective, I've helped to found and mobilize for a significant number of the most well-known climate campaigns around the Western world, is because I am fundamentally interested in living a good life rather than whether it will work. But having decided I want to live a good life, then obviously I'll try and be effective within the confines of that virtuous orientation. So I'm not ruling out instrumentalism, of course, because instrumentalism is core to existence as much as virtue is. The point is you have to start with virtue, as many wisdom traditions have made clear, and also as modern social scientific research shows, most of the effective classical civil resistance episodes of the last 100 years being primarily motivated by religious logics, whether that's Buddhism or Christianity or Islam. And this is largely ignored, of course, by the secular social scientific literature because I think this is where I'll start saying unpopular things, but in my view, the biggest block to transformation is not the right but the left, in the sense that there is a certain construction that there's always evil in the world, but what makes evil, as it were, is the complicity of people who administrate that evil. Obviously, the big example is the Nazi period. And unfortunately, the left, broadly speaking, is the administrative class, which basically enacts the agenda of capital. It administrates the education system and the local government systems and such like. And because it's addicted to reformist logics, then it becomes the controlled opposition, as it were, to capital. So the revolution, when it comes, won't come from the left, as it's presently self-understood. It will come from a prophetic, force beyond the left, which is broadly what happened with Extinction Rebellion, which was, systematically ostracized by the left in the UK. And a similar thing happened with Occupy in New York, as you may be aware. And these dynamics are largely brushed under the carpet. But as a sort of frontline organizer who actually gets things done, you can, if you talk privately to most organisers around the Western world, you'll know that the A will privately tell you that, the biggest problem is the left itself, rather than, the bad guys. And this is sort of similar to Martin Luther King's, classic pronouncement from a Birmingham prison that, the main problem is not the Ku Klux Klan, it's white moderates. And this is not some sort of unpleasant, bitchy, sectarian point, right? It's a social scientific observation that people are mobilized through naivety and passion and transcendence. They're not mobilized through analysis. And analysis is really the way in which you construct reality so that reality cannot be changed. And this is what I call left defeatism. In other words, everyone on the left loves to analyze. And the general logic is as follows, which is the bad guys are doing bad things. The people who are suffering are the people with no power. Because they're being oppressed, they're not able to get any power. And the subtext is, and therefore there's nothing that can be done, right? And you have to break out of that sort of analytical logic, right? And the big problem here is with the whole secular construction of the left, is that the left has no understanding of dynamics that go beyond materialism. And that's the heart, I think, of the problem. The problem is metaphysical, that no one understands what prophecy is. And this is a unique phenomenon, right? It's only Western society and 10% of Western society for the last, 150 years that has been obsessed with this peculiarity. But as I'm sure for 99% of history, people have been they see themselves situated in a porous, enchanted reality where miracles happen and, there's an open system, as you might say. And people aren't concerned about whether they're going to win their battles or not. Or what they're concerned about is whether they're going to become close to God or, constructions like that, which, as you know, are complete a complete no-no to the secular left. Just have a nervous breakdown if you said something like that. But that's, I'm just a simple social scientist at the end of the day. And social science basically contradicts social science. People aren't primarily interested in power. People are primarily interested in social connection and meaning systems that give them recognition. And if that means they have to get shot or something, then so be it. The grid of, self-interested, materialist, reductive Newtonianism, that whole complex that came in with the Enlightenment is empirically illiterate. People just, as we all know, if you do any practical research, people just endlessly don't follow how they're supposed to work, right? According to the diktats of, the self-interest paradigm. And this is the problem, this is the problem we're up against.
I was in London during the LSX protest right there at St. Paul's, filming, interviewing people. And it seemed like there was a lot of naivete about the future and how things would work, and everyone's just going to sit around, play video games. And I'm like, most people, and I think of some of the Chaivala I've had long relationships with over the years in places like Karnataka or Gujarat, they love their jobs. They want to wake up every morning. They're not the richest people at all on the earth. But do people want to have Game Boys and play videos all day? And so I began to really query this kind of leftism that I couldn't relate to at all. That on top of this quasi-religious doxa that has definitely enrooted itself within leftism. It is quasi-religious in the sense of, I believe that many people on the left, good hearts or not, they believe that they are the just cause. And I begin to see this as a kind of crusade against what they view as the reticent, the racist, the homophobic, you name it, phobic right. And what I saw during lockdown was telling a different story. I saw people on the right in my home country, the US, in Canada, fighting for the right to mobilize, to move out of their houses, to take over the streets. I'm thinking of the truckers along the Canadian-American border, but much more. There were protests of people from the right. And the left was busy saying, and I mean major outlets like, Jacobin, publishing lockdown, baby, lockdown pieces. So, Roger, I began to think, who are these leftists? Because that's not me. And the more I spoke to people on the left, there was a split in the left because there were people like me who were like, this is crazy, this lockdown, this is against all the Geneva Conventions. And then there were those, the pajama class, because of course there is the pajama class on both sides of the aisle. And they were very happy to be ordering in from Deliveroo, unconcerned about the wages of the Bangladeshis or the Pakistanis delivering food to them, right? So, and very unconcerned as well, of course, about the ecological imprint of the restaurant sector itself, which is worldwide huge in terms of damage to the planet. You've spoken about the need for a shift in worldview to match the scale of this ongoing crisis. How does a fundamental understanding of our place in the universe beyond just ecological data actively inform the strategy for frontline action when, as I've just explained, I witnessed this kind of crisscross strangers on the train type of thing where the left was not identifiable to me because people saying to shut up on lockdown, to shut up and take the vaccine, to me, that's illiberal and it's not at all progressive. And I can't even say it's leftist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways into this, the various conundrums here. And maybe, I'm not saying this is the only way in, but I think one way in is to look at the position of Nietzsche in Western culture and how Nietzsche has broadly been appropriated by the right, particularly obviously in the Nazi period and also in the neoliberal period. And I mean the sort of culture and general worldview that Nietzsche sort of propagated, which obviously comes through various sort of sources, so people don't realize they're being Nietzschean, even though they are, if you see what I mean. But I think the broad point here is what Nietzsche was saying is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. In other words, this orientation towards life where taking risk is exciting, creating your own reality is exciting, creating your own values is exciting, going out and enjoying life, loving your fate. And this orientation is extremely important for significant proportions of human personalities, right? As opposed to, to caricature somewhat a sort of leftist parentalism where, everything is dangerous, everyone needs to be protected, everyone's vulnerable, and we just need added protections for everything and safe spaces and all this sort of business. Now, the point here isn't that one's right or wrong. The point is that there's an imbalance. And if a movement is going to become hegemonic, then it needs to be able to appeal to a majority of a population in terms of designing a hegemonic strategy. And at the moment, because the left is saturated I mean, less so now because obviously it's coming around to the threat of fascism. It's thinking about it more. But at least, up to the last 3 or 4 years maybe, it was very self-congratulatory in terms that it saw the world primarily as a way of denying death and denying the transcendent and denying the excitement of risk and all these sort of interlocking complexes of orientation. And I think there is a certain sort of critique of left, which has been going, back to the French Revolution. It is this romantic critique of the left in that sort of philosophical sense, which is the left basically doesn't get what people want to do with their lives, which is to do something amazing, and lift themselves up and experience hardship and experience death and all the rest of it, right? Sort of, obviously there's sort of like Freudian themes coming into play as well. And I think if the project to overcome the growing project of 21st century fascism is going to work, then we really need to reorientate the left towards its pluralistic roots, which are not, there is the sort of Fabian, Stalinist, Puritan sort of side to the left, but there's also the romantic side to the left, with Wordsworth and, Byron and all these sort of people, right? And if you're looking at the Anglo-Saxon traditional, Schelling and, Hegel and this sort of thing in the German tradition. And all that has been, deadened out, right, with this neoliberal logic of the left over the last 40 years. And I'm not saying, just for the record, that, these guys have got it all worked out. What I'm sort of arguing for is a nuanced reconstruction of what it is to be left. And it has to involve the celebration of being and the celebration of risk and the celebration of competition and all the rest of it, right? Because this is what's going to attract the middle ground, which will otherwise go to the far right. And we see this all the time, across Western societies where the left actually supports leads to the attractiveness of the far right because it's so patronizing and, nannying and just arrogant, really, about ideas that it just doesn't want to come to terms with. It's interesting, I've talked to I'm organising an event this weekend, for instance, to sort of bring together community groups and such like to prepare for what's happening in America, in London, if the far right wins the next election, which is quite possible. And the groups that are most resistant to it are what you might call the political left, because they don't want to engage with cultural strategies. What they want to engage with is a sort of closed silo sort of worldview where all there is power and logic and analysis. And they don't want to, go on the street and actually get their hands dirty in many different meanings of that word. And tragically, of course, they hold the legacy power of the left. They self-describe themselves as the left, and then, of course, the left becomes discredited because they're so useless. This is this phenomenon. This phenomenon goes right into even the more successful elements of left, like the Mandani sort of scenario, or the Your Party scenario in the UK. I've done some work with people in New York around the concept of enabling a participatory democracy to emerge where people feel some control of their political reality, in New York. But the problem is the left establishment, even in the Mandani space, basically sees popular participation and cultural strategies as a sort of add-on to what you might call the hard wiring of power politics, which of course it's not, it's just empirically illiterate. People are mainly mobilized through cultural dynamics, what people are doing, what their families doing and, what their friends are doing and all the rest of it. And so it's like the old paradigm is still in grip there. And a lot of this really comes down to, the statist left and the syndicalist left, whether the left can abide by the idea of giving ordinary people power over their environments, and as opposed to a sort of performative, participatory scenarios where you just don't ask people what they think and you still decide. And I think if there is a future for the left, and arguably if there's a future for human civilization, it's about creating mechanisms whereby people can participate in power in an actual real way. And I can give you an example of this in a minute if you're interested.
Yes, I am. I wanted to go back to some of the things you were saying about the foibles and weaknesses, I'd say, of the left, because one thing I've been disheartened by, to say the least, it makes me curse certain subjects about this, is the left's adherence to a dismissal, an utter dismissal of historical materialism. And material reality is important. And when I mention this, I am specifically referring to the left's morose embrace of identity politics, which I have serious problems with. I think the highlighting of what the managerial elite, to use a term from Adolf Reed, it's very important that we start to look at the development of the managerial elite from the time of Thatcher and Reagan to the present. Because what has been handed to the workers of the world has been not better working conditions, not housing so they don't have to travel 3 hours to get to a very underpaid job. And you know this because in the UK, I was living in a council estate that had been sold off. I was a private renter, but as you know, during Thatcher, she diminished the social housing situation to such a degree that there is virtually very little left, and certainly not directed at the people who need it most. So these neoliberals, because they're really not leftists, but people who embraced identity politics and their be-all of the day and of their life is pronoun badges. I have a serious problem with this, Roger, because here we have, while I was living in London, there was a kid, I believe he was 19 years old. He lived in Islington. He killed himself because he was unable to pay the council tax. And the first thing that goes through my brain is, what on earth is any council giving a 19-year-old a bill that would result in his suicide? This is insane. He's one of many cases. And you yourself, when I read about the number of years that you were sentenced to for civil disobedience, you didn't murder someone. I believe there are people in UK prisons who are in jail for similar time periods for having killed someone. So what is going on here such that the people who call themselves leftists are neoliberals? They're not. And then parts of the left, because this has been a fracturing moment. Remember, the day before Starmer was elected, he finally answered the question, what is a woman? This has divided the Labour Party. The Green Party has similar problems, but they're not talking about it very much. And you go party to party to party. And women are very upset about the gender issue. Lesbian and gay groups are now upset about the gender issue. There was that recent article in The Spectator, in fact, about this just 5 days ago. Why is it that the left that should be able to recognize the managerial class as just a pawn in capitalism, that they are the people that sort of run between the uber elite and the middle and lower classes to say, we got it, we're all good? People aren't seeing through this mechanism. I do, you talked about this earlier. But why is it that so many people kowtow to the most moronic ideology, knowing that their neighbors are unable to eat or may off themselves because they can't pay a council fee?
Well, the one-liner sort of, analysis is during the neoliberal period, the function of the left was to, do the soft power role for capitalism, which basically is the left, as itself describes itself, is basically the administrative class for capital. It's not the working class. The working class, exited left, self-described left spaces, about 30 years ago as a general rule around the Western world. So it's not surprising, and it's not particularly interesting in a way. It's just any objective analysis needs to see that. In the same way as, socialists identified liberals as the administrative class of capital, in the 1880s to the 1920s, right? Liberals were basically the main problem that had to be overcome, which is why the original left, as it were, in the late 19th century split off from their alliance with the Liberals. The strategy over the next 10 years is for a new left to emerge that splits itself off from the administrative, neoliberal, identity-orientated left for all the reasons which are now reasonably obvious. And the positive news here is, when I started, when I left being a farmer, the high point of the neoliberal left hadn't been overcome. But I think over the last, the benefit of Trump in a certain way is the collapse of the credibility of that old neoliberal left. And now there's a greater fluidity in various spaces about how to construct an actual new liberatory left, which is based upon the empowerment and participation of the working class in politics. And that's that's a sort of completely opposite strategy to the neoliberal left. And I'll just give you an example of how this, just an illustration, right? So an illustration of how this works is that, as I'm sure you know, one of the big sort of positive design elements for a pro-social revolution in the 21st century is the concept of sortition-based citizens' assemblies where people are selected randomly. So, the voting systems can't be dominated by the neoliberal left and such like. So there was, I think it was in Belgium, there was a big experiment on, running citizen assemblies. It was a major project, and at the beginning of the project, the middle class people who entered the project were more pro citizens assemblies than the working class people, because they saw it as a performative way in which, participation can happen and what have you. But at the end of the process, having viscerally experienced the actuality of going through the process of deliberation in a free and open space, predictably, the working class people changed their opinion and decided this was a really good idea. And then they asked the participants, whether citizens' assemblies should become a constitutional element, in the way the government is run in Belgium, and in other words, get real legislative power. At that stage, the enthusiasm flipped. So the middle class people, who obviously stood to lose their, interpretive and middle man sort of power, were opposed to this. But the working class people, of course, saw a way in which they can materially liberate themselves by getting real power. Were super enthusiastic about sortition-based systems because, of course, sortition-based systems, by definition, will provide the membership of assemblies with 50 to 70% working class people, depending upon, how you define working class and the particular social structure of a particular space. But you can see the obvious attraction objectively for the working class. So, this is a sort, that's for me like symbolizes what's going to happen over the next 10 years. That if the left, objectively speaking, is going to be able to overcome fascism, then there needs to be mobilizations outside the self-describing left. And obviously some people within the self-describing left will transfer over because they'll see the error of their ways, as it were. But the rest of the neoliberal left will go the same way as liberals did, between 1900 and 1940, right? Becoming an irrelevancy because the main battle will be between a revigorated, real left and fascism. And that I think is a reasonably robust analysis of what's going to happen. And I think to the extent that this new left is going to win, it's got to overcome its puritanical, managerial, neoliberal heritage and re-engage with its romantic roots, i.e. there needs to be parties, there needs to be religion, there needs to be carnival. We need to return to that ecstasy of just being human, as you might say, as opposed to the dreariness of puritanical negativism, as you might say. Everyone's bad, everything's going to hell. It's like, no, people need to party a bit, because we're human.
I completely agree. I also think the left shoots itself in the foot by demonizing what they call the right, when oftentimes I'm seeing this. I read and watch news across the political spectrum. I find these years, since lockdown especially, more criticism of class inequality coming from the likes of Tucker Carlson than I do from people who call themselves leftists. And I find this a paradox. I really think we need to be offering, if not bridges, then olive branches. You talk about how analysis can only take you so far. Analysis is good, but we also need to think of a praxis that will not demonize and alienate people who might have even more productive ways of getting to that end goal. Because I'm more convinced now than ever that the struggle of class liberation will come from both sides. And I even think that both sides is finished. I think more and more people are saying, who cares, left, right? What does this even mean? We were just locked up for several years. When I talk to Australians, or here, I'm living in Italy. I passed lockdown in Italy. I should have a Purple Heart. This is insane what we went through. No discussion is happening about that at all. At all. No one wants to have a kind of nunca más that happened in Argentina after their dictatorship. We will have no investigation. And the revolution is most definitely not going to be televised. So if rational evidence-based discourse has its limits, what is the non-rational or metaphysical engine that you believe is necessary to sustain people in the face of what looks like defeat?
Well, when I spent about 7 years doing research on the psychology of mobilisation at King's College, and it was on the basis of that research that I think the big paradigm shift, as you sort of just indicated, is from thinking that people respond to information and argument and logic to what I would call a sociability paradigm, where people respond to how people treat them and the activities and logics of people around them. In other words, proximity, what's happening around you. And I think there's overwhelming empirical evidence for that. And the only reason why this orientation hasn't become mainstream is because of this whole, psychological and political lag effect of this Newtonian paradigm and rationalist paradigm that's dominated public discourse during the neoliberal period. But it's pure ideology, as we know, right? Because as soon as you go out and do field work, as I did 7 years of field work, right? Looking at campaigns and looking at how people actually, act and what their self-understanding is when they do act and such like, as opposed to sort of projecting a particular social scientific ideology upon their motivation. So, I started off, like most blokes of my generation, having a broadly rationalistic orientation, but 2 years into my PhD research, I had a bit of a nervous breakdown because I just realised it was bollocks, It just didn't make sense. And, we've all gone through that sort of paradigmic sort of like horror, where you realise the whole way you're looking at something is just wrong, right? And there's another way of looking at it. So, so this all might sound a bit metaphysical, and it sort of is in a certain respect. But I think we can cut to the chase, which is that the practical mobilisation design has to be centred around what I call sociability dynamics, and then there's three or four sites of sociability dynamics. So the first site is on the doorstep. So the way in which we're primarily going to defeat fascism is by being with people on the doorstep. And you notice how I'm phrasing that, right? The left usually says, we need to go door knocking and talk to people. Like the last thing you want to do is talk to people, because the way in which you create sociability dynamics, in other words, like trust and interest, amongst people, that are in close physical proximity to each other, is through the magic of listening. In other words, if you listen to people, then people talk, and they will become animated to the extent that they engage in the act of speech. And I can produce overwhelming evidence in my research this is true. So that's the first thing, is listening to people on the doorstep. It's sometimes called deep canvassing. We can talk about more of it if you like, but that then leads to the assembly format. So instead of, the usual left format, which is, the great and good white men usually stand up and give an intellectual exposition about why the bad guys are bad guys, like that's in my research, that led to 20% empowerment as opposed to an assembly format. So the point about assemblies is not just because they're politically attractive to allow people to, participate in their collective creation in a sort of Paulo Freire sort of tradition. The real point is that people become massively enthusiastic to the extent that they split up into small groups of 6 to 8 people and have go-rounds so that everyone gets to speak. So everyone becomes encultured in that micro space to speak. And once people speak, if you're from a working class background, this is quite a phenomenally emotional experience, because for most people, most of the time, in this world, then people are not listened to. And the last thing that happens is anyone asks people of their opinion. So people become extremely emotionally fluid and are then open to some new form of self-understanding, i.e. some sort of left collectivity, for instance. And then the third, there's 2 variants. The third thing is that human collectivities cannot thrive without some form of confrontation. And this is what animates sociability. Like, if nothing's going on, then, everyone goes back to watching Netflix. And there's 2 forms of confrontation. The first confrontation is the election. So I'm extremely pro standing elections. And people from the old anarchist left will say, well, it's terrible, but they don't understand what I'm going on about. I'm not talking about standing in the election as a reductive, win the election and therefore you get the power sort of Newtonian conception of what an election is. What I see election is a form of carnival, an oppositional carnival, where people celebrate their competitive, collectivity. People go out and will door knock night after night after night because they're trying to win. It's like a sport, right? But the byproduct of this is it creates radical left collectivities, right, at a grassroots level. And the other sort of way is obviously what I'm well known for, is forms of civil disobedience. So, for instance, like, I helped to set up the first rent strike in London for about 30 years. And I can tell you a few little tricks about it if you like. But before the rent strike was called, you'd struggle to get 6 ordinary people to come to meetings to discuss, and quite rightly so, because people got no cultural experience of a rent strike. But once the rent strike was called and there was a prospect, of the landlords evicting people, and there was a high drama situation happening, then 60, 70 people were coming to meetings, right? So this was nothing to do with the subject matter of the meeting, right? It was the contextual space of confrontation, right? Give you another bunch of stats, like when Martin Luther King went over Selma Bridge, right? The first time he went over, I think there was 250 guys did it, and they all got beaten up, which was great as the theory of nonviolence, elucidates, because there's what's called a backfiring effect. And the next time, I think there was 400 people. And I can't remember the exact details, but I presume they all came to a slightly unpleasant end as well, with the police beating them up. So on the third one, it was something like 700 people. And it wasn't just 700 people. It was also, the head guy from the Jewish community and the head guy from the Anglicans, and they're all marching across the bridge. Well, why was that? Because confrontation basically creates sociability and solidarity dynamics, right? And of course, this is what the neoliberal left completely doesn't get, which is why they never engage in confrontation, because they have adopted a capitalistic logic of, cost and benefit analysis, that there's no ambiguity. Either something's a benefit or it's a cost. But of course, in real life, everything's a cost and everything's a benefit, because, reality is complex, and you like something and you don't like it at the same time. That's how real life works. And of course, you don't like going on a march where you're going to get beaten up, but you do it because other people are doing it and your friends are doing it, and you're pissed off anyway. And then you get beaten up, and then you become even more, committed, paradoxically. Again, not all the time. Sometimes people burn out and, have a horrible time. So I'm not denying the empirical basis of, repression working, but repression is fundamentally indeterminate, right? In which, of course, social science never can understand indeterminism, because it's, has a Newtonian metaphysics. But the fact of the matter is, it's a quantum universe. You just can't predict what's going to happen, which is, another subject. But that's the praxis for the next 10 years. It's like speaking with people, listening to people on the doors. It's about community assemblies, which create, collectivities around elections or rent strikes or council tax strikes, or, and then once you've got to that stage and then you roll, the role of organisers is to roll it out and to train people. Well, most of the people that are going to be trained are not people from the left because they're too set in their metaphysics and their dogma, right? Most people, as every organiser knows, once you get past a certain level of mobilisation, then primarily the class of people who will become organisers are people that have got no experience of politics. And that's a good thing because it means that they're open and naive, as you might say, from a cynical leftist point of view, which is good because then they go out and actually do the work rather than deciding, they're going to free ride or just not get involved because instrumentalism predicts it won't work, which is self-fulfilling, of course.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. Your experience as an organizer, what are the main struggles, given that what I have seen within a lot of organizations, and I dare say most, is that there's very little working class representation. When I think of the Pussy Hat March, that was organized by a bunch of feminists in academic roles. I saw no grassroots participation at all, which explains why that crashed and burned pretty much. And it's sort of a joke into itself in a way too, because like the No Kings March, what the heck is that about? Are we going to only represent everything about Trump's ethos and have nothing to say about the masses? Are we going to continue to pretend it's only Trump and that Biden and Obama, et cetera, have nothing to do with this? What I'm finding is that there's a real problem within the left of allocating speaking roles, representative roles to academics often, and to pretending that the problem is Farage or Trump. So we're not really seeing criticism from the grassroots that is not being framed by a rather elite corner of our society. And I wonder if the managerial elite are not having way too much power, even not only from one side of the paradigm, which is the oppressive side, but also from the ostensible anti-oppression side. One must wonder, is this controlled opposition? Why are the people's voices not more out there? And I'm not criticizing any particular party, but you've seen it too, where so much of what is called grassroots organizing, well, there are grassroots organizers and there are people speaking to people at their doorsteps and they're organizing in churches and on street corners, and that's all good. But those very people doing the leafleting are elided, forgotten, and we're only seeing the same talking heads on television.
Yeah. Well, you've got onto the heart of the problem, which is that, the social movement elite left, as it were, is the controlled opposition. And that the controlled opposition has a very clear self-sabotaging strategy, which is to engage in mass demonstrations that only last for one day. And as everyone who's, spent any time reading the civil resistance literature, if you want to create real power, in other words, if you want to go beyond the performativity of, the No Kings protests or the Palestine protests in the UK, then number one, you have to come back every day. And number two, you have to move towards low-level civil disobedience, which is, sitting in squares and staying there, right? That's the paradigm. And there's a complete chasm between those two strategies. And if you challenge the elite elements that control the Palestine marches or the people that control the No Kings marches, then it's the same as the middle class going against the working class in the Belgium Assembly, right? Ostensibly, they're into mass participation protests. Well, they're absolutely against any real power being transferred from the elites to the working class, i.e. ordinary people, right? So this is, well established, and anyone who's a smart strategist, needs to take this as the foundation of what our strategy needs to be over the next 10 years. So we don't really need to deal with that in more detail because it's empirically obvious. I mean, in the UK, there's been 500,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people, I think something like 30, 40 times going out on the street, having a demonstration in this performative neoliberal way. But if you go to the organisers and say, well, why don't people occupy the bridges? They look at you as if, you're totally mad. Because, of course, that will put their own status on the line, right? In other words, they'll end up going to prison. So what, it is another subplot of the administrative classes take over the left, which is the golden rule is the leadership never puts itself on the line. Unlike, Martin Luther King or just about everyone before 1989. And the only sort of slight variation on that theme has been the civil resistance climate space, where people like myself have been put into prison for 5 years, right, for doing a Zoom call about civil disobedience. But one of the things, I won't go on about this too much, but basically not a single celebrity has gone to prison in the UK over the climate, either on the climate or on Palestine, right? And you compare that with what happened in the 1960s, where people were serious about the civil rights struggle. So what the analysis that comes out of this is that what the new vanguard, new left has to do is enable the working class communities or the lower middle class communities that are doing the hard work for these controlled left spaces to be a class for themselves, as the old Marxist phrase is. In other words, they need propagandizing and saying, these guys that say they're running things for you because they've got your best interests at heart are basically traitors to your objective interests. And what needs to happen is there needs to be what you might call a neo-syndicalist right resurgence on the left, where working class communities act for themselves. And the middle class vanguardists, like myself, to the extent that I am middle class. I mean, I did 28 years of manual work, so maybe I'm working class, depends how you describe it, right? What we need to do is forget going on these marches and going through all this performativity of so-called activism. What we need to do is organise in working class communities, because all that paraphernalia of the liberal space is going to collapse in the next 5 to 10 years anyway, because of the extremity of the crises coming down the road, right? What's going to determine whether we're going to have fascism or not is whether we're going to have self-empowered working class communities. And this sounds like a massive job, but if you don't mind, I'll give you an example where it could, there's good reason why it could be faster than you think, right? So myself and some of the community organisers went to South London and we put 300 posters up in a ward. This is about an area of 50 streets in an urban area, which is basically a unit in terms of local elections. And we got 20 to 30 working class people to come to meetings because we put posters up where working class people, live or what have you on bus stops and the entrance to flats. Out of those assemblies, we emerged working class candidates. And then we put these candidates up as independents. We were going to form a political party, but, it's quite bureaucratic in the UK. And then we built teams to go out door knocking, right? And you knock on people's doors and working class people, and then they'd say, oh, do you want to come along to meetings? And then you can join, more people and do more door knocking, and you get a sort of feedback loop. But the critical design here, as I think I might have mentioned, but I just want to reiterate the key fundamental difference here, which is with these mobilisations, the working class assemblies, the community assemblies chose the candidate, and those communities chose their programme, right? So we knocked on several thousand doors and we were saying, what are the big issues? And, it was, housing and, rubbish on the streets, all this sort of thing. So that became the programme, which, of course, from a purist leftist point of view is really boring because it should be, what the left people think but that's not the point. The point is the Paulo Freire point, which is if you focus on the process, the politics comes with it, as opposed to telling people what their politics should be. So by the end of the campaign, these working class people were going out every night. They had shift work, and it was difficult. I'm not saying it was semi-chaos, as you can imagine, if you do this sort of work, right? But the fundamental point was these people were massively animated, and they didn't win because it was a 6-week campaign, and there was various problems with it. But the point is this is how you animate a working class community, and then you have to do rent strikes and labour strikes and all this sort of stuff as well. And there's ways of doing it. And through that, I think, I'm a numbers guy. I think in a matter of 2 or 3 years, you could create a real left movement in Western societies. If you had several hundred well-organised, vanguard-esque sort of activists who basically changed their strategy to community organising, or this type of community organising, right? Because a lot of community organising obviously is neoliberal in the sense that, you go and do a rally outside the local council and other performative routines. What this involves is real power, right? You either stand in elections or, as I say, you go on various forms of non-cooperation, to use Gandhi's phrase.
I think a lot of certain thinkers, Freires are one of them. I also think of the part where he writes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he indicates the danger of the oppressed becoming oppressors. And I'm thinking in terms specifically of Gaza. And I'm very worried about the state of resistance along with the state of journalism today, where in the last decade, we've seen the decimation of what Assange organized, which was really an outing of war crimes across the board. His imprisonment, unjust, of course, yours, many others. Snowden is currently holed up in Russia. There are many people who have been persecuted from these so-called Western democracies. Meanwhile, our governments have directly and indirectly participated in the war in Iran this year. And this is, again, reported in the media as a regime. Where is the mention of the regime that put you for peaceful protest into prison? Others, Palestine Action, the last decision just a few weeks ago. People are facing long sentences for basically stating what post-war Germany might be considered laudable, that speaking against genocide is good. Giving the thumbs up to genocide, giving pieces, supporting indirectly and directly through munitions and parts is bad. And I'm sure you've seen the parallels between what you've gone through. Can you talk a bit about this? Because you spent how many years in prison? And what did you glean from this experience? Because it must be a real head scratcher. You know what you've participated in. You know where you stand on the side of actual justice, not this kind of prescribed Palestine Action is bad justice. Could you talk a bit about that and the kinds of struggles that you had to confront within yourself while imprisoned in terms of your role, both what you have done in the past and what you are now engaged in?
One of the big problems here is that there's a neoliberal construction of cost and benefit analysis, isn't there, right? Which is totally embedded within the capitalist logic. If you buy bananas more cheaply, you derive a benefit and all this sort of stuff. And the neoliberal is being colonized by that logic, which is, if someone knocks you on the head, then that's really bad, and it's unambiguously bad. But as I've said in my previous answers, this is simply empirically unjustifiable. It's illiterate. If you actually look at people in prison, there's a vast plurality of different self-understandings of what that experience means, which just brings us back to the age-old wisdom that reality is whatever you make of it, right? You have the agency to interpret what happens to you. Obviously, in principle, not all the time with everyone, right? But as a general principle, it's true. And the problem, of course, is that the neoliberal left, and the liberal space generally has no idea what's really going on, right? because it just has this flatland analysis. What's really going on is the preparation for the revolutionary moment. I mean, once you've been put into prison a few times, I've been to prison 7 times, going to prison is something like going on a night shift, right? It's just another thing that you do. It's not particularly pleasant or unpleasant. Obviously, there's risks that extreme events could happen, just as there are in many activities in life. But as a general rule, it's part of the routine, right? And if you look at civil resistance struggles and people's self-understanding, people after a certain level of oppression, it's as if they can't be oppressed anymore. They move into what you might say is a psychological steady state where they're prepared for prison, they're prepared for violence being enacted upon them, and ultimately they're prepared to die. And this is why regimes collapse. And one of the reasons why the left sabotages the revolutionary project is by pretending that it's a straight line. You know, if you're oppressed even more and oppressed even more, then you're more disempowered and you're more disempowered, and then you can't do anything, which is total bollocks. It's like you're oppressed and you're upset about it, and you're oppressed again, and then you get angry about it and you rebel, and then you're oppressed again, and then you go, I don't give a fuck, you know, because I'm coming after you guys, whether you kill me or not. And that's, in other words, like it's a U shape, right? You know, if you oppress people too much, then you know, it's like an oppressive parent. You know, if you hit your kid once, you know, it's probably going to be really effective, even though it's a bit antisocial. If you knock them twice, you know, maybe they're just going to be really bitter. But if you knock them the 3rd time, basically you've lost that relationship for the next 30 years. They don't give a shit about you, and they're going to hate you forever, right? And, you know, you see what I mean? Like, this is how human dynamics actually work. Humans are not pieces of dead matter in the Newtonian universe, right? They're living spirits, and they need recognition, and they have the ability to regenerate themselves, and they're able to say, fuck you, you know, in the most outrageous of circumstances, which is, you know, what every Hollywood movie's shown, right? It's an archetypal, central, mythical construction of what it is to be human, which is the ability to say, fuck you to evil. So this whole neoliberal thing is just, you know, it's just hilariously inaccurate. And I just get asked endlessly by, you know, journalists, tell me how terrible it is in prison. And they'll expect me to say how terrible. Well, you know, actually, I had a great time in prison. I was there for a year and a half and read 100 books and, you know, wrote 3 books and met some interesting people and had a good think and came out rejuvenated. You know, it's like, that, you know, just for the record, that doesn't mean that happens to everyone, but it certainly happens to a significant minority of prisoners. And I was on the block with lifers, you know, so these people had murdered people and things. So, you know, it's not like they weren't, you know, these people have done bad things, no question about it. But I would say 30 to 50% of them were more spiritually advanced than 90% of the general population in terms of the work they'd done on each other. And they should really be let out tomorrow, of course, you know, because they're okay, basically. But you see what I'm trying to say? I mean, it's not like this isn't the agenda, right? As far as I'm concerned, the agenda isn't about being miserable about shit things happening. The agenda is how we're going to create, you know, ecstasy in the 21st century, right? And that ecstasy doesn't come from a neoliberal sort of strategy of making sure everything's nice. What it comes through is through a revolution in how people see what it is to exist as a human being, right? And there's lots of different, you know, cultural inputs on that. I mean, a classic one is Sartre's notion of, you know, bad faith, which is, you know, this pretense you don't have any choice. Of course you have a choice, right? You have a choice, however shit your life is, to go, fuck you, I'm going to enjoy myself, right? And I'm going to take down the regime and die, you know, or die trying, like, which is the great revolutionary tradition. And those people weren't miserable. They were probably a lot happier than most, you know, leftists in office jobs in New York, pretending that, you know, they can't do anything because it's going to upset their mortgage payments. You know, this comes back to Nietzsche, doesn't it? You know, it's like, do you want to live as a slave, or do you want to live as a man? You know, I mean, obviously, you know, we've put it in a language which is quite problematic, but the fundamental point is still valid, which is the real violence of neoliberalism is not inequality, it's the destruction of the human spirit, like, which isn't say, you know, human inequality isn't outrageous. Obviously it is. But what we need to reanimate is the human spirit. And we do this through prophetic examples, you might say.
You spoke about this need for us to embrace, I'm paraphrasing here, but our lived reality that isn't just some kind of 80s film. It's not a rom-com. People are struggling. Many people have come to understand what struggle is because pre-lockdown, they were middle class. Today, they are no longer. They lost their businesses. I see it here in Italy. So many people went out of business. And if they were above the age of 40, this isn't the US where you can reinvent yourself. In Italy, if you're above 40 and you've lost your business, it's very likely that you will not be doing a job of your dreams. Let's put it that way. And so all this 1980s movies that anyone who was an adult then can remember of just following your dream and just be big and bold and be you. Well, this is a lot of poppycock too. What does speak and resonate, I think, to people is the human suffering. You spoke of Sartre, his inspiration for much of his work, both in, I guess, the larger existential body of his work, but it came from the post-colonial struggle that he also wrote of actively and even participated in. But this did not get translated to Western university students right away. Thinking about this idea of you have a choice and how this was even encapsulated within avant-garde theater at the time, the great destruction after World War I that gave birth to Dadaism. And I'm just thinking about all these cultural markers that even scarred the human conscience. People were destroyed by World War I. And there we are going at it again, World War II. And then we've got the Frank Capra films where the U.S. pilot flies over and saves Europe. I mean, the absurdity of some of the narratives that Hollywood has coddled and presented to the world about the U.S., the savior. Meanwhile, you've got Russophobia on 5 Alarm Fire. Here we've got the moronic Callas and von der Leyen trying to ignite that war front. Unbelievable, but it's just absurd. And on the other side of the pond, we have this kind of fragmentation of the American dream. Everyone knows it's gone. Trump failed in his deal. The reality TV president was elected because he made a series of promises. His first term was one of the most nonviolent of my lifetime of any U.S. president in terms of starting new wars. At the same time, he went ahead and did all this madness, especially since 3 January of this year. It's off the charts. So how do you see the future of leftism where we have people on the right who agree with most everything that we're saying? They are perhaps Christians, so the leftists don't like to include them because they're Christians. One of the things that shocked me when I was at LSX filming and just living in London in general was this overt hatred of religious people. And I found it alarming to me. And I'm not a Christian, but I would say to people, but they have a right to believe that. Here you are buttressing 99 gender identities, which is just as unprovable as their God. And I was very alarmed, Roger, by this shunning of the spiritual. At the same time, I've heard from many people who've contributed to the magazine or come on the show or have done work in some of the work I was involved with in the UK regarding the feminist struggle against gender identity. And a lot of them said to me since lockdown especially, you know, I was never religious, but lockdowns made me rethink this. And I think that a lot of what the left has done is to alienate the religious. So when we talk about left and right, a lot of times people are mistaking this for agnostic or atheist with religious, where, again, you listen to Tucker Carlson, this guy is not right wing, okay? He might misunderstand. I think a lot of the people do who are pundits. They think that leftism or Marxism is something completely different, but I won't dive into those weeds yet. I just think that the left is doing itself no favors to isolate religiosity, to spirituality, some of the things that you have spoken about, this idea of embracing suffering. This is like at the heart of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I mean, what happened to understanding the struggle that our great grandparents went through? right? This is part of who we are. We have rights simply because people fought for them. And those rights are not indelible. They will be taken away if we do not continue. As Assange, as Snowden prove, they will be taken away. It could be us holed up in Russia. It could be us in a military prison.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could talk about this reconciliation of the need for a spiritual or cosmological grounding with the risk of becoming detached from the urgent, gritty reality of political and economic power. How do you reconcile this need for the spiritual with the latter?
Well, I think there's two sort of broad things we can say about this. I think one of them is that because the left is, the neoliberal left anyway, is, situated in what you might call the flatland of cost-benefit analysis, it's unable to make a categorically distinction between the sort of the misery of oppression and the joy of it, right? Or the joy of rage. When people, if you take the word rage, for instance, right, within the neoliberal concept, this is really a function of vulnerability. It's like someone's done something terrible to you, you're uncontrolled, terrible things have happened, and your rage is uncontrolled, and your rage is a sign of failure. Do you see what I mean? And that's the psychological construction of what rage is supposed to look like for the neoliberal left. But of course, it's entirely possible, using a broader anthropological or psychological analysis, to say rage can be a form of ecstasy because it's a release. It's a release of your slavery mentality when you actually scream your head off at your oppressor and you enjoy it in a certain sense of that word enjoyment, which is quite nuanced, right? It's not enjoyment that you're eating a banana. It's enjoyment because you're becoming your authentic self and your whole self, and you're basically becoming like congruent, right, in terms of what you think it is to be who you are, for instance, right? It's also about the joy of being in solidarity with the other, because being in solidarity with the other is a core determinant of mental health, right, as a matter of empirical research and blah, 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 and also obviously, the revolutionary traditions. So the vanguard of this new left, if you want to construct it like that, one of its key strategic like objectives, apart from engaging in this grounded community organizing, is creating a culture of the enjoyment and ecstasy of struggle, as opposed to the horror and grind and misery of struggle. It's great to struggle because it's great to play football against your a big team. Do you see what I mean? You're going to lose, but you don't give a shit because you're going out there and you're doing it and you're doing your life. You know what I mean? And this is a phenomenon that has got lost over the last 40 years. And unsurprisingly, this is one of the reasons it's so difficult to mobilize people, because people associate politicization with Puritan misery, right? Was this happening and this happening? And the whole of left discourse is about miserization. It's like Gaza and unfortunately you've got to go on a march and you could be doing something else, like something enjoyable, so capitalistic logic. No, you want to go on the march because you're fucked off and you're glad you're fucked off, because the world's got evil in it and you're doing your thing and you're playing your part. You see what I'm saying? So that's one element, right, which is bringing complexity and ambiguity into the notion of a certain way of being, right, so that it's not obvious that what you're doing is miserable. The same with being in prison, and this connects with loads of wisdom traditions, traditional Christianity, and all the rest of it, right? It's not hardly original. That's one thing. The second thing is, the second, key agenda for a new left is the reconciliation between the left and its romantic roots. And its romantic roots are basically a pathway into religiosity, right? Romanticism was basically, elements of the left going, capitalism is terrible, it disembodies the world, it disenchants the world, it makes everything into a cash nexus. And we want to celebrate the richness of being, right? We don't want to be sitting in a factory. What we want to do is go on a carnival and get pissed and, have sex and things like this. So it's like that element it needs to be brought back in by a new left, which has been excommunicated by all the Puritans over the last 30, 40 years, that, we need to do the managerial routine and things we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. And I'm working with a bunch of people at the moment with this slightly sort of humorous title about how to create a new religion, which, obviously, if some secular left people knew about it, obviously they'd have this total horror. But the interesting thing is, of course, privately, a lot of people will say, yeah, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to do. There needs to be an animation, a reanimation of what it is to be, right? There needs to be a re-enchantment of the world. And that needs to be concretized through ritual and ceremony and color and, art and culture. And then people start feeling like they're being human. And that's what will make them join the revolution, right? Not because, some bad thing is happening somewhere. It's like, it's, to my mind, it's totally bloody obvious.
Right.
Because after a certain amount of reading, you've actually read about what revolutionaries did in, the 1880s or, even to 1968. You've just got this joyfulness, which has nothing to do with stuff or outcomes. It's all to do with a realization that it's actually quite fun being alive.
Exactly. And to relate to those around you, which is something that's not happening within neoliberal circles. Certainly, this focus on identity is anything but identity. That's the paradox of identity politics. Really, identifying is not identifying with yourself and your navel gazing. It's identifying with your community, with those around you.
Yeah. You're totally right. I think, the plurality of different identities is actually the reduction into a single identity paradigm, which is bad things are happening to me and I need to feel miserable and I need to blame everyone else for it, right?
Yeah.
It's just variations, different colors of that paradigm. The other identity paradigm is I'm fucking great. I'm going out to live my life and I'm going to give the people, who are doing me in hell, right? And I'm going to enjoy it. Yeah. That's the other paradigm. It's like neoliberalism creates this symbolic world, doesn't it, where there's supposed to be loads of plurality, but there's no plurality at all, right? It's just a miserable, puritanical, Anglo-Saxon nightmare. Right,
exactly. No, it reminds me of what I found when I was working in Haiti and loads of NGOs, loads of UN staff. And I worked with some of them, even though in the end I worked against them. Paradoxically, I wrote a book about the takeover of that island by the global elite, what the Clinton Foundation did. Why are the Clintons not in prison? You went to prison. This is a paradox, you see. And so when I think back to when people, or even people in my family will say, well, his daughter works for the UN, like that's a good thing. And if I say, well, Roger went to prison, that's supposed to be a bad thing. And this is the problem, is that we've checkboxed people by terms of now, in the late 20th century for sure, what they do, what their position in society is. Yet this is not how we ought to be looking at the value of humans, because that is not actually a translatable or quantifiable measure towards how people input into society. The volunteer sector, people with allotments all over the UK, they are participating in something even if they don't know they are. I come across people who will say, oh, I'm not political. And I said, I've got some very bad news for you. If you drink water, you're political. If you breathe, you're political. All of these things that we do are part of a project. And then they try to say, well, I don't. Well, no, politics is pretty much everywhere. And I don't think this is new either. So I'm wondering if the current crisis that we're living through is a symptom of a fundamental ontological error in Western civilization. What is the practice of correcting that error while simultaneously fighting for concrete policy changes?
I think what we need to acknowledge is, the romantic left has generally been individualist and not organized, right? Yeah. And for good reason, because it's quite easy being a dreamy idealist when you don't actually have to, work with other people. So I think the big challenge for the 21st century is to create a sort of neo-romantic left, which is actually good at organising as well. And this is where there's a whole bunch of, cultural ways in which people can work together, which is empowering and respectful and encouraging and participatory and what have you. And I haven't really got time to go into them. Suffice to say that they are out there and they're waiting to be enacted. But this is really the big challenge, a dual challenge really, which is the institutionalization of this new paradigm. There's a million books, as you know, right, are criticizing, the neoliberal left and, talking about the importance of quantum mechanics and ancient wisdom and all these, the romantic traditions, all these elements. Well, they're all individualized and they're all unpoliticized. And what we need to do is to take this religious impulse and politicize it in order to take control of the state. And this is like nothing that's happened in history before, because it's never happened. But we shouldn't be afraid of something new happening in history, because history is full of new things happening. No one thought the French Revolution would happen. Obviously, it's a classic example. So we shouldn't be looking. This is one of the main things. We shouldn't be looking at the past. We should learn lessons from the past. But what we're going to create over the next 20 years is going to be radically new in the human record. And it's something along the lines of this integration with the ability to organize at scale and go into confrontation and maintain a humanity, right? Those are the three different elements of it. And I think one of the most important points here is about people moving out of the reformist space and into what you might call classical revolutionary spaces, or, it would be called classical revolution. And this is something that no one's really taken seriously since 1989. But the whole of the 20th century was full of this orientation. And the classic example is Gramsci, right? As you know, Gramsci spent most of his life in prison. But he was really clear that was the place of the intellectual. The place of the intellectual was in the prison and was on the floor of the factory, like this notion of the organic intellectual. And I think this is the big message for, a lot of people that might be listening, right? It's going to do you no good, and it's going to do society no good while you remain employed by the neoliberal state in universities, right? Obviously, some people might want to stay in universities for a very good reason. But the main move here is for a critical mass of radical intellectuals to move out of the university space into new institutional spaces that are going to challenge the existing system and give intellectual structure to the revolutionary project, right? And this is how the revolutionary project matures. And, we don't need to go through the 101 examples of revolutionaries, failing and then leaving their university spaces and going out, doing work with the peasants, whether it's Mao or India or, the Decembrists in Russia or 1968. All the, there's loads of examples of it. But this is yet to really take root in Western societies. But I think it will over the next 5 years, not least because of what Trump has done to American universities and what's probably going to happen to, universities increasingly around the Western world as the far right comes to power. But also because we're heading up to 2 degrees, right? And the idea that the present, social democratic settlement is going to be maintained is becomes increasingly incredible. And I think people over 50 are not going to make that transition. But I think younger intellectuals and younger academics and younger people who have moved into, the administrative classes, a lot of those people need to move out. And by what I mean by a lot, I mean 1 or 2%, right? It doesn't need a lot of people, as we know from Erica Chenuith's work, right? You only need 3% of the population to rebel in order to make significant structural changes. So this is obviously, I say this to academics, look at me, with a certain sort of horror, as if they're going to have to go and do, get a job in a bar and wash up. But, manual work's fine. I've spent most of my life doing manual work. It's okay. The sky doesn't fall in, and it's good for you because it connects you with working class life. And, there's nothing like actually being there and doing it to give you the humility to become in service to the working class rather than, write papers that no one reads in, mid-level universities, and I know it's a harsh thing to say, but, you have to say harsh things at the present moment, because it's not going to get any easier while people make strategically irrational decisions like sticking around in the system when the system's going to collapse. And it needs some pioneers to create new colleges, new educational institutions that are rooted in working class communities. Literally, this is what we're trying to do in London at the moment, is try and buy a big warehouse and as a pilot for creating new spaces for the new cultures that need to emerge. And rather than little boutique things, right? We don't want food co-ops that involve 20 people in some nice radical middle class suburb, right? We want food co-ops that have 1 million people in them, like they did in the 20th century, with large, fully paid staff. This is the sort of thing we need to be looking at. And this is what I predict is going to come back, not least because, food crises are coming down the road. And as various people have said, as soon as white people start dying, then that's when you'll have your Vietnam moment, right? And people will actually decide the system is genuinely fucked, and there'll be a massive nervous breakdown amongst the middle classes of the Western world. And some of those people won't make it, but some of them will. And then we'll build, we're going to build the new Jerusalem or whatever it's going to be out of the horror of the death that's coming down the road. So, which it brings us back to Nietzsche, doesn't it? So maybe we should end on the Nietzschean note. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's not his most famous quote for nothing, right? Because it's the most subversive notion that undermines the neoliberal paradigm, isn't it? It's like, just go out and enjoy yourself, love your fate.
I completely agree, Roger. In fact, I'm seeing the collapse of universities in the US, and I think we will see the closing of universities more and more as these kids, unlike British kids who finish with a much smaller debt level, in America, these people are not able to pay their debts back, and they are not forgivable. Unlike in the UK, if you don't pay your student loan debt within so many years, it will be wiped away. In the US, impossible. So we're seeing people finish. I saw this in the 90s where my students were coming to me for letters of recommendation for internships. I'm like, is this an unpaid position? Yes. Well, you really shouldn't, and I was like trying to talk to them about the practicality of this, because already there was one of the financial crises that happened right then. And I think we're going to see a real change. I'm very hopeful that there will be new experiments in learning. I was part of a group that was trying to do a pop-up university. I left London then. And I'm hoping that some of these experiments will happen.
Was it called the Anti-University by any chance?
Yes. There were two of them, and one of them was that. The other one, I've been racking my brain for both of them. You just said one. And I'm very interested in this because I put this is a story. I put an ad out in the paper at one point before I decided. I was not sure about leaving London. I thought maybe, I was very dissatisfied. I had a visiting position at Goldsmiths. I didn't like what was going on there either. And I thought, we need a new kit and caboodle altogether. Yeah. So I had this, I kid you not, a hedge fund manager reached out to me. Now I have nothing to do with these people, but she says, I can give you some information about what you would need to do to create a university. She knew everything. Now this is creating a university in the sense of accreditation and all that bollocks. This is the problem. If you can get rid of all that accreditation bullshit, and it is bullshit. It's like if you want to open a yoga center, you have to be part of this. It's called Yoga Alliance. I know because I was accredited to teach yoga in India, came back to the West, and it's like, what the fuck is Yoga Alliance? It's a bullshit institution that just rakes up money because then you get the tick, you get the little symbol on your webpage. I'm not doing that, but it's the same thing. So I'm hoping that people can toss out both the structure and the bollocksy accreditation system, but that, you know what's happening within the British system with the RAF, and it's all gone tits up because what's happened is the better researchers are doing more bureaucracy now than ever, and they don't have time to do the research. It's become untenable. I hear from former colleagues what they're going through, and I'm not envious.
You can see why the Nietzschean revolution is so powerful, right?
Yeah.
Because the reason why all these academics are in slave mode is because they haven't read Nietzsche. They don't realize that life is not about conforming to the powers that be, right?
That's right.
The joyful life is to love your fate and create your fate, right?
That's right.
This is, as I said, the greatest crime of neoliberalism is to cut people off from our cultural and spiritual roots, which are saturated with the heroic journey dynamics, right? And variations on the theme. And it should be like exciting to leave a university and go and do a bar job, because it means that, like Orwell did, it's like, it's great. Yeah, it's like, this is it. I'm living my life. I'm not sitting at a desk filling out a form because some guy basically has some hold over me, right? And this is the human story, I met some people at Cambridge University the other day, they've just left their department because it's all got neoliberalized and they're on contracts. And I said, well, why don't you set up a new college in London? And it's a bit like, it's a slave mentality. They couldn't quite get their head around the freedom that you have, right? It's not actually that difficult. To do social research, you don't need loads of money. I mean, I did 7 years of running around London. I did award-winning research, serious research. It didn't cost me anything. I was just sitting around watching campaigns, having chats to people. Yeah. I had a laptop. It didn't cost me a penny. I mean, obviously, if you want to do, biochemistry, that's another kettle of fish. But in terms of creating, another classic example was LSE. LSE, as you may know, was set up by, left Fabians, right, in order to do social research on empowering the working class. That was its original remit. And that was done, in about 1905. And this just goes on and on and on. And if this isn't the moment to start creating new colleges, when is it, as far as I'm concerned? We're in a total crisis, the biggest crisis in the history of the human race. We desperately need the intellectual labour, integrated into the movements. And that's broadly what I'm trying to do, in London at the moment, is create a new social movement that combines, cooperative banks with workers' co-ops and housing co-ops and community groups and, community campaigns with an educational arm broadly along the sort of Mondragon model, right? Which, as you probably know, was really driven by a bank which, everyone put their money in the bank and then you could afford to buy housing and create workspaces. And then everyone went to the training college to, get encultured into a cooperative ethos. So all of this is waiting to be done. And, to be honest with you, I'm quite excited at the moment because, this is things are so bad. We are going to go over 1.7 next year. It's like, I like to think I'm a realist. So I was going like, I never realized that, when we started Extinction Rebellion, we were going, well, it's going to be pretty bad by 2030. And here we are going into 2027, probably with mass mortality events within 12 months. And as I said, that as soon as white people die, the whole thing's going to explode. And that's not in question as far as I'm concerned. The question is there enough intellectual labour that has been institutionalised into collective form that can, react rapidly enough and effectively enough when these inevitable ruptures happen? So we don't get what happened in Valencia where, 200 people died and 100,000 cars were wrecked and everyone started voting for the far right because the far right got in there with their message that central government was rubbish and, these neoliberals are crap and you want to vote for us and get rid of the migrants. There has to be another narrative, which is, no, we're going to get rid of the rich because we can't afford them and we're going to have some fun.
Right. It's far easier to point to the migrants than the actual ruling elite on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, but only because the leftists will sit on social media, right? They don't get out and do the door knocking, right? We need a complete transformation of the culture. That if you're not out in the street, you're basically a fucker. You're betraying the cause. This is, and there's been moments in history, as I'm sure you know, where basically that is the ethos on the left. You're out actually with the peasants. You're out with the workers. You're out on the street. And if you're not, then you're basically a bourgeois deviationist, or whatever nasty words they used to call for people. We need a sort of compassionate, slightly more respectful 21st century version, when we go to these people and say, at best, you're totally irrelevant. And at the worst, just fucking everything up because you're getting in the way. That's the message. And, it has to be a sort of semi-hilarious, joyful message because it can't come from a place of desperation. It's got to come from a space of we're living our lives, And this is what I say to people. The single biggest fuckness of the neoliberal left is the obsession with the question, what is to be done? Which is pure instrumentalism, right? Obviously it comes from Lenin, but various other people. the key question that needs to take the place of what is to be done, which is, how am I going to live the rest of our lives? How are we going to live the rest of our lives? You see what I mean? Regardless of what happens. And then it focuses the attention on what it is to live a life. And as lots of people said, you have to focus on the whole first, right? Before you go into the instrumental, the right brain instead of left brain, if you look at that literature. But this is the big shift. And I'm battling at the moment, to get people to change all their framing. So instead of putting on the leaflet, come to the meeting, we're going to make a really big impression and all work together. So we're going to come to the meeting and we're going to have a chat and get to know each other and realize we're all human. We're going to enjoy ourselves. And then we're going to go out and basically overthrow the ruling class. You see what I mean? But you have to do that, what Gandhi called self-purification work first, or, whatever you can call it, secular phraseology if you like. But that's the one of the central practical, intellectual, organizational imperatives of the next 5 years is to get this whole movement into some sort of metaphysical order, as you might say.